You are listening to a discussion born in the Christian ghetto. It is my pleasure today on this episode of the Christian Ghetto podcast to welcome Dr. Carlo Lancellotti to the podcast. Dr. Lancellotti is a professor of mathematics at the College of Staten Island and has become more widely known to many in our circles because of his work translating the philosophy of Augusto del Noce. Well, welcome, Carlo. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so this is one of the things. Just before we were coming on air, I decided to hit the record button because having done some work as a graduate faculty assistant in translation work, I know that doing translations are often thankless passion projects that don't bring a lot of financial return and are a huge distraction in your case from what you normally do, which is teach mathematics and physics. So what was it that led you to decide, hey, I should really start translating the works of Augusto del Noce? There must have been something going on in and around you that you were seeing and thinking that this would be a really useful thing for the English-speaking world to have access to.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, I've been living in the U.S. since 1990, and I've been always somewhat fascinated by how in the similarities and differences of certain cultural processes in the U.S. compared to continental Europe, in particular what we could call processes of secularization. And I always had the impression that due to the different trajectories, the U.S. was at the same time ahead and behind of my experiences when I was growing up in Italy, where I come from. And I was always struck that in some sense, some of the lessons of European 20th century, for natural reasons, are still not completely familiar to the English-speaking public. And I'm talking specifically of how people talk about fascism and communism and totalitarianism and secularization itself. And I thought that sometimes this is why certain processes have caught people off guard, so to speak. I mean, in a sense, you could argue that for a lot of, say, Christian, Catholic, or generically conservative people in this country, for example, the Obergefell decision, that was kind of a symbolic turning point, because I still remember in the 90s, there was an idea, in some sense, there was an American exceptionalism about secularization, which in some sense the U.S. maintained a high rate of church attendance, and atheism was rarely professed by people. And I remember there was a conversation between my friend, Professor David Schindler, you may have heard, he was a prominent Catholic theologian, and another famous public figure, Father Neuhaus. They had an exchange back in the 90s on this topic. And I was on Schindler's side, I must say, in the sense that you could see that the processes were taking place in a very similar way, but in some sense people were a little less conscious because they had not gone through the 20th century. People here thought that communism only occurred overseas and that, Marxism was completely foreign to American culture. And when they talk about fascism, they have no idea what they're talking about. They just talk about fascism as a generic form of bossy authoritarianism or something like that. So I had a feeling that the European experience could be of help to these challenges. And certainly when I was growing up, one of the great interpreters of European 20th century history was Del Noce. I thought that really his understanding of totalitarianism, of fascism, of communism, his critique of Marxism, for example, his critique of the sexual revolution were not available. Nobody else had proposed anything similar in this country. If I should think of people with some similarity, maybe Christopher Lasch at some of those topics, but not with the philosophical depth of Del Noce. So I thought that it would be an original, hopefully helpful contribution to the debate. If I have to give just one example, I remember as I was thinking about these things, I was visiting my parents back in Milan, Italy, and my dad had a volume by Del Noce with the essay that has probably been most successful, the one called The Ascendance of Eroticism. And I was browsing it, and I noticed where he says that in 1970 he wrote, well, given these premises, there is really nothing surprising about ideas like homosexual marriages. In 1970, I think most people would have found that idea quite surprising. And he didn't, because he had this ability to extrapolate the logical development of certain processes. So that made me think that really he was very prescient, how do you say it? You know, he was
Prescient.
Prescient, that's the way you pronounce it. Prescient, right? He was very prescient. I know how to read it. It was very present, and so I thought it would be a useful thing to do. I mean, I also thought that if I didn't do it, nobody would ever do it, because, you know, in translation, going back to your comment on translation, besides the lack of funding, there is also what I call the chicken and egg problem, which means that if you are not known, nobody translates you, and if you are not translated, nobody knows you, right? And this has happened to very significant figures, in my opinion, including certainly Del Noce. So.
Well, and, you know, this is one of the reasons why in graduate school they, you know, to get a PhD, they make you learn at least 2 foreign languages, in part because this sort of translation is a necessary, you know, the thing is, if you can find an author that isn't widely known and do some translation work and do some scholarship on them, you can accelerate your career quite quickly, because you're opening the English speaking world to an author that, again, nobody's heard of, right? So it's, again, that chicken and egg. So you end up doing the grunt work. You know, and oftentimes it's a graduate prof that sort of says, hey, if you want to do something interesting, I think you would enjoy translating and commenting on this gentleman.
Right.
And that is often a great way to, I know a number of guys who have done stuff like that. Now, it's interesting when you started. One of the things that I found extremely refreshing with Del Noce, and kind of startling again from a North American perspective, is just the frankness with which he and sort of almost blasé way that he discusses fascism. And, you know, to see him interacting with fascist authors, to me anyways, it gave his work something that a lot of others didn't. And perhaps maybe you can comment on that a little bit.
Oh, that was one of his big themes. And if you're interested, there is more to come, because I'm translating his book called The Suicidal Revolution, which includes some of his work on Gentile and fascism itself.
Oh, that would be exciting.
Yes. I mean, I'm thinking about to write in the introduction. I'm going to write that if you want to understand fascism, you have to read this book. But to read this book, you have to get into the tickets of a lot of Italian cultural history that maybe you don't want to know about. Because really, fascism was a very specific phenomenon, which was mysteriously elevated to a cosmic, universal, demonic entity, right? I mean, the Italian fascism was very particular, very peculiar. I mean, it was a combination of Marx and Nietzsche. I mean, you know that the young Mussolini was a revolutionary socialist, and he was fond of Marx as the prophet of the revolution, and then he got into Nietzsche, and he thought of combining the revolutionary idea with this supermanism, you know, Übermensch. That was the background of fascism. But then this revolutionary kind of aspect, which was is often forgotten in this country, fascism typically has been interpreted in 2 ways, right? Either in terms of the opposition with democracy and liberalism, which is true. There was opposition to democracy and liberalism, but also communism was opposed to democracy and liberalism. That's just a negation. It doesn't tell you what fascism was about. And then in the second aspect, there is the aspect that was due to some extent, I think, to Wilhelm Reich, the idea of fascism associated with repression, with also Adorno, the authoritarian personality, right? Fascism, this kind of sociological, psychological interpretation of fascism as an authoritarian spirit, which in some sense then becomes repressive, sexually repressive. And during the sexual revolution, the 70s, the 60s, the 70s, the fascist was some kind of, again, bigot, repressor, right? I mean, and this kind of very generic interpretation has completely taken over, but it certainly doesn't fit the historical data, because fascism, as Del Noce describes it, is the result of a precise philosophical tradition, which is, in a nutshell, you stop me if I go into much detail, but in a nutshell, is the idea of a Marxism without materialism, right? So it was the idea of a Western revolution, as opposed to the Leninist revolution, because people in 1919 were very afraid of the Soviets, of course. And so fascism, in a sense, proposed itself as anti-Leninist, but in some sense progressive, revolutionary without the materialistic aspect of Marxism. This idea goes back to the famous, it is in Italy, philosopher Gentile. Giovanni Gentile was the philosopher of fascism, and Del Noce gives enormous importance to his book from 1899, The Philosophy of Marx. He thinks that this book titled The Philosophy of Marx is, in a sense, in a nutshell, the ideology of fascism. You see that this is kind of paradoxical. and what Gentile does with the philosophy of Marx is that the philosophy of Marx is correct, except for this debris, these survivals of 18th century materialism, which has to be dismissed. And instead of having this materialistic aspect, you have to have pure praxis. So you have to take the aspect of Marx as humanity changing the world, that humans self-create. They create themselves through their work, and there is no fixed ethical or moral or whatever categories, because we create our ideas as instrument to dominate the world. Okay, so Gentile, this is what both Gentile and Gramsci called the philosophy of praxis. And Gentile's effort as a philosopher was to totally extract the aspect of Marxism as philosophy of praxis and separate it from the aspect of materialism. So now Del Noce draws a line of development there, and it concludes that if you have this pure philosophy of praxis without a materialistic theory of history like Marx also had, what's left is a passion for activity for the sake of activity, political activity for the sake of political activity. And Mussolini is the embodiment of this. It's a solipsistic desire to impact the world. You need to make a difference. You need to produce change. And this making a difference, this producing change, becomes an end in itself. And so there is this transition from this kind of half Marxist to this solipsistic activism. Right? So this is Del Noce's diagnosis of fascism, but that's not what you hear in school these days, and so it is very different. But if you track Italian history, you can easily see it. The problem then is that fascism got associated with Nazism. And of course, even here, Del Noce has some doubts, because he thinks that, yes, there was an alliance between fascism and Nazism because, again, they had the same enemies. They shared the same enemies. But in their derivation, they were very different phenomena. In Del Noce's assessment, if there is a danger, it's more of a neo-Nazism than a neo-fascist. But I don't know if you want to go in that direction.
Well, it is interesting because, and unless I'm misreading, but one of the things that struck me in Del Noce's analysis was rooting both fascism and Marxism in a post-Nietzschean world, in a sense where you're grappling with the reality that God is dead. And so what do we do? And then I guess, my shorthand would be that, on the one side, you would have liberalism, Marxism, and progressivism, which are all kind of future utopian visions. Mm-hmm. And then you had the reaction to that, which was fascism, Nazism, and others that are in then a past utopian vision. So the one is, we sweep away the present order, and this will then usher in the glorious future. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, you have the fascist who sweeps away the present order to usher in some perfect state in the past. And if I'm reading it right, Del Noce's critique was that both of these moves are post-Nietzschean, in that the past utopians are grasping for a spirit, a religious sentiment that they don't actually believe in or share, but yet somehow they view as powerful and in need of reinstantiation. And then I think Del Noce's was things that we have to find a third way between these two alternatives as a way out of the dilemma of the 20th century, if I'm reading it correctly.
Well, what you're describing is absolutely real. I don't think that Del Noce would associate that kind of past utopianism mostly or above all with fascism itself. Where he sees that very much so is, for example, in the Action Française, that was this kind of right-wing French movement started by Maurras. That's a perfect example of what you described. And because Maurras was an atheist who wanted to create a confessional Catholic state, or
that just
right. Or there is a whole tradition of Catholic integralism, for example, that dreams to go back to the Middle Ages, to the Christian Commonwealth of the European Middle Ages. That's very true, very real. But fascism and Nazis, Del Noce doesn't read them as really looking at the past that much. Because for him, in Nazis, there is a purely prehistoric past. Because the Aryan man, is not historical. It's not that in the Middle Ages or some other time there was the German Nietzschean blonde beast. If anything, is a mythical feature. It's not a historical feature, right? So it's not that Hitler wanted
like antediluvian or proto-history kind of thing.
Exactly. So it is kind of it's more mythological than historical. Fascism is even more complicated because I know that in fascism there is all the rhetoric of the Roman Empire and going back to that. But Del Noce personally doesn't take that very seriously in his reading of fascism because he thinks that really fascism was about Mussolini. I mean, that fascism was like a very kind of egocentric phenomenon because of that Gentilian inspiration I tried to describe before, or that solipsism, or that activism, in which even nationalism was kind of instrumental. I mean, it was done sort of in bad faith because it was convenient, because it was the natural political alliance. But it's not that Mussolini was devoted to an historical past like the Catholic integralists are devoted to the Middle Ages, for example, right? It's not that Mussolini had that for him the Roman Empire as a society was a past utopia. While for the Catholic integralists, the Middle Ages was a past utopia, right? You see the difference I'm trying to establish?
Yes. Yeah, no, I get it.
And that's why for him, not fascism in particular, the opposition he described is real. There is one side, the kind of the progressivist, whatever, the other there is maybe the integralist. But for him, fascism is a very modern phenomenon. I mean, it is a different type. It's a different attempt at revolution that failed, and which probably is not coming back because it failed as a revolution, not as a restoration. You see what I'm trying to say? Yeah,
that makes sense. Yes, so it was also, in a sense, even though it styled itself as reaching to the past, that was basically not in good faith. It was still largely a future-oriented utopian vision.
It was
different from
a rhetorical exercise. It was an attempt to gain shine for Mussolini and whatever, but it was not really that he was going to reestablish the Roman society under Trajan or something. It was propaganda. It was essentially propaganda for him.
Okay. Now that in a sense, the other question that I think the listeners might benefit from is the understanding the process whereby Marxism, the revolutionary aspect of Marxism and the internal conflicts of Marxism get resolved in Marxism being absorbed by the bourgeois managerial regime in the form of progressivism. And I think it would be helpful for people to maybe walk through how Del Noce understood that.
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. It's probably one of Del Noce's most important intellectual legacies, especially for us today, because we have seen that process unfold in our lifetime still. To get to it, I mean, Del Noce thinks that Marx is an unstable mixture, because on the one hand, there is this aspect of critique, of materialistic critique, that exposes the hypocrisy, say, of traditional morality, of the church, of the family. All these institutions are exposed, are unmasked as somewhat fraudulent because they are covers for power, essentially. Like Marx, there is this idea that ultimately there is ideology, the German ideology. There is all this discourse about religion, the family, virtues, blah, 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 which are really there to protect the capitalist system of power. So there is all this critique, which is essentially materialistic, which is combined, and this is what makes Marxism powerful, this messianic hope for history to save us. History will bring about, there is a mechanism in history, in capital, by which, in a sense, the contradiction of capitalism will explode it and it will fall apart, and then the proletariat will come to the rescue, and history itself will save us in some sense, right? So you see that there is this negative aspect and there is this positive aspect. There is the aspect of critique, and there is the aspect of expectation, faith in history, a sort of deification of history, as Maritain would put it. Now, these two aspects, if I explain them clearly, are contradictory. Because if the revolution, the miracle of history, resolving, bringing the reign of freedom from the ashes of capitalism, if it doesn't happen, what's left of Marxism is the purely corrosive, critical aspect of undermining the family, undermining religion, undermining classical philosophy, undermining all the things that are exposed as masks, as false consciousness. And so in Del Noce's idea, the trajectory was that you would go from Marxism to the extent that the revolution was tried. After the revolution, he says, commits suicide because the reign of freedom does not materialize. Then the corrosive aspect that came before the revolution, the critique, will endure without the revolutionary catharsis. And so the total effect of the Marxists will be just the critique, right? And so the post-revolutionary situation is nihilistic. Okay? This is what he calls the suicide of the revolution. The revolution, in a sense, kills itself and leaves nihilism behind, right? And so, if to him, contemporary history started in 1917 with the Leninist revolution in Russia, then the fascist revolution in Italy, the Nazi counter-revolution against communism in Germany, and then after the Second World War, the bourgeois attempts to go back to the Enlightenment, to, in a sense, go back to the French Revolution, if you want, but then in the form of sexual revolution, because then there is a new interpretation of revolution, also in the sexual sense, is this trajectory that it criticizes but cannot build, cannot ultimately create, and so leaves behind. I mean, that in a nutshell, that's what he sees happen. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's right. And then so that's really largely what sort of evolves into critical theory, and then kind of gets cut loose from there. And the rather than tearing down the bourgeois state, the bourgeois power regime sort of takes it over. Right. In the form of progressivism, and that becomes more we're going to manage our way to the glorious future rather than destroy everything and undermine it. And I think one of the things that Del Noce mentioned is that the revolutionary aspect then gets turned not away from the bourgeois regime towards the traditionalist. Yeah. So those who have an active Christian faith and then also those who are more like secular traditionalists, and those then become the enemy of progress. So rather than attacking the bourgeoisie, you attack the traditionalist as the enemy of progress.
Yes. There was this transition which happened, in his opinion, in the mid-50s. He talks about that in The Crisis of Modernity. I mean, essentially, his view is that, after World War II, in some sense, the Western elites, the winners, especially in the English-speaking world, had to answer what had happened with fascism and Nazis, the Holocaust, and also they had to confront the Soviet Union. They had to confront communism. And in his opinion, they did it precisely. They could have done it in two ways. They could have gone back to a more traditional Christian value system and opposite to communism, and maybe that happened up to, for him, Eisenhower. But then there was kind of a conscious decision, not conscious, but a collective, semi-conscious decision by the Western intelligentsia that you could beat the Soviet Union on the ground of greater secularity. And he describes this as a return to the idea of the French Enlightenment, essentially, or it could be also the Scottish Enlightenment, but the ideas of the Enlightenment, right? A return to the ideas of the Enlightenment, science, universal rights, individual freedom, and so on and so forth, in opposition to communism, right? So now this, in a sense, was irreligious, was an attempt at an irreligious secular answer to communism, in which, incidentally, because of the materialistic, he kind of accepted the materialistic aspect of communism without the Marxist revolutionary ideas. So in this process, of course, there was this switch in which the idea of a class-based revolution magically turned into the idea of sexual liberation from sexual repression, which is a very bourgeois sense of revolution. It's like the revolution for the bourgeoisie, because it's individualistic, it's individual, right? It's not about class, it's about that everybody can become a little revolutionary to himself and freeing himself by sexual repression, from prejudice, from bigotry, from traditional narrow-minded sexual morality, right? But you see that it was kind of a practical switch in which and here the author he quotes is again Wilhelm Reich. He found Reich very representative of this trend. So there is the kind of bourgeoisification of the revolution, as you mentioned, which is one of the main pillars of this larger kind of progressive secularity in opposition both to Marxism and Christianity, unified by the fact of being both religions, right? Because from this perspective, from this worldview, Marxism itself was a secular religion. And so since we can, in a sense, go back to the Enlightenment polemics against religion of the 18th century and recycle it against Marxism. So I'm saying that was a bit
of... and I think in the past, I've heard you say too, that in the end, in order to beat the Soviet Union, they, in a sense, in some ways became their enemy. They embraced the materialism of Marx, but then almost put it on steroids by combining it with bourgeoisie materialism and the pursuit of sort of individualism, as like you were saying, that the revolution in some sense becomes the individual's desire for personal emancipation in a secular environment. Yes. And so utopianism becomes personalized.
Yes, exactly. I mean, one thing that I think is understudied is the role of the human and social sciences in the US in the 50s and 60s, for example. Because when I talk about this idea of the Noce, many people in this country object. That makes sense, but it sounds very European. This country, Marxism was never a big thing except for fringes, right? And so they tell me, the U.S. Communist Party was never a big party, and but the question is that, in a sense, the way, first of all, it's not even necessary to trace this thing back to Marx as a single author, because ideas can always be rediscovered. But this kind of, let's call it pseudo-Marxist sociologism, meaning that you interpret everything materialistic in terms of the economics, in terms of sociology, in terms of psychology, in my opinion, in the United States, took the form not of orthodox Marxist-Leninist doctrine, but of the typical mindset of the human sciences. I mean, if you read about, there was a book by Christian Smith, the Sacred Project of American Sociology. I don't remember the title, but and then there was then if you read about the sexologists of the 50s, Kinsey, McMaster, I don't remember the names, but if you look at academic sociology, sexology, psychology, they were very materialistic and very atheistic, right? So the locus of this atheism, if you want to call it that way, of this idea of self-emancipation through science and through the human science in particular, this new materialism, one of its main locations, if you wish, I think, was in academia, in the human and social sciences. I could be wrong. I'm not an historian, but it would be worth studying, I think.
It's kind of interesting when you think about what we have as our preconceived, almost like the brochure versions that they hand out the brochures at the meetings, and this is sort of tells us what we're doing. But when you look at it this way, we generally think of in the North American context, individualism as something that is in a sense conservative. There's a liberal aspect, but preserving somebody's individual rights is seen very much as a conservative idea. But yet at the same time, this conservative idea, it largely results in a sort of a personalizing of the revolution.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, some of these categories have to be rethought, because individualism can mean many different things. It could mean that you recognize the human person as relationship with God. So there is something that you cannot violate. There is something in the human person that demands your respect. But there is also another idea in which you see the human person as completely autonomous, as self-creating. And then that's the very opposite. I mean, both of these can be called individualism. So you need some kind of philosophical anthropology. Now, I would say this. In my opinion, since early on, American culture tended to be very bourgeois. Okay, I'll say it. I mean, in the sense of having a very strong sense of a research for earthly happiness by an autonomous individual, isolated from a network based on some ideal transcendent dimension. I mean, this seems to be not new. I mean, it seems to be to have been around for a bit in this country. The question is that it was kept in check, if you wish, by the strength of Protestant Christianity. Throughout American history, these two poles, this Enlightenment tradition and this Protestant tradition, that were in some kind of truce, or in some sense supporting each other. I guess I'm not expert on this, but you could say that after the big crisis of the 20th century, this fell apart, and the more materialistic, individualistic aspect broke off from the old Protestant framework and took a life of its own, and became this kind of hyper bourgeois individualistic ideology. I don't know. Does that sound right?
That's right. And it cloaks itself in the traditional forms of sort of the place where it grew up, which is, sort of the democratic West, and especially American democracy that way. There is also this dynamic, though, too, post World War II of the revolutionaries attaching themselves to this new progressivism, and then with the coming of the sexual revolution, then so personal liberation, anything that then gets in the way of this becomes identified with fascism. Right. And I think that's one of the things that Del Noce notes, is that the enemy is the one who threatens your own pursuit of personal utopia.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's true. Again, maybe fascism should not be the precise terminology, but yes, that's true. But how can I put it? I mean, what is the biggest? I mean, already since the 60s, there was a very strong streak, what I would call technocratic scientism, and then that kind of went hand in hand with the sexual revolution and this kind of individualistic bourgeois liberalism. Now, that is the sort of bed, what's the word? The soil, the ground from which then you can get this kind of pseudo-Marxist revolutionary ideologies that you see these days, wokeness and that kind of thing, which is opposed to it. Okay, they proclaim themselves to be opposed to that traditional liberalism, but in a sense, that's where they come from. I mean, I don't know how to put it. I mean, let's put it this way: ideology always fills a vacuum. If you create a vacuum of meaning, a vacuum of purpose, in which, in a very positivistic, scientific, technocratic culture, in which you cannot ask religious questions and religious insights are not allowed to the public domain, this creates a tremendous void of meaning that people will fill with political religions. But maybe religions is not the best word, with political myths, with political mythologies, right? So all I'm trying to say is that the people who kind of tear their garments about this semi-totalitarian or even totalitarian ideologies that we see today, they should also have worried about the vacuum that they created. I don't know. That's
right.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, by embracing that sort of hyper-materialistic, like consumerist version of materialism, and
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and basically satisfying my material needs as a substitute for satisfying my spiritual needs, then creates this vacuum that can only go on for so long.
Right.
The one thing I think I've heard you once and was not able to find the talk back again was you commented on the notion of vitalism as essentially, whether it's branded as from the left or from the right, essentially both aspects come out of this same milieu, the same post-world milieu, this bourgeois atheism, materialist focused world of the individual revolutionary. And maybe you could talk about this, because this is one of these topics that gets raised in conservative and right-wing spheres over and over again, is this idea of vitalism as opposed to the brutal ugliness of the regime. So that the pursuit of beauty, strength, personal vitality as a way of opposing the regime.
Yeah, of course. And that's questionable. Let me make first of all a general comment. This point of vitalism in Del Noce goes back, in a sense, to that crisis or that decomposition of Marxism that you asked me about before. Because in Marxism, there is that positive aspect. The positive aspect is the revolutionary aspirations, the faith in history, the faith that history will bring us beyond alienation and we will recover God in ourselves. And so in Marxism, there is a positive aspect combined with the critical destructive aspect. As I said before, our society is the result, in some sense, of the failure of the revolution. But now, when you lose your faith in, again, history, in the revolution, in communism, in whatever it is, and you want to produce this more individualistic, you want to embrace this individualistic bourgeois idea of liberation, from repression, what is the positive value? The only possible positive value, Del Noce argues, is material well-being and a feeling of being alive, a feeling of vitality, because there is no transcendence, there is no heaven, there is no utopia anymore, right? In fact, the word utopia, we can use it in an analogical way for the individual, but really it's not a utopia in the traditional sense is a world order, right? Like Thomas More. I mean, it's a society. In this case, there is no more a society because there is no glue. There is no ideal philosophical or religious or metaphysical glue after you give up on the Marxist one. So what is left is this desire to feel alive, and this is one possible popularization of Nietzsche. Not fair to Nietzsche, obviously, but it is, you know what I mean. It is the idea of, yeah. I mean, there is certainly vitalism in Nietzsche, and so this is the form of that nihilism I was talking about before. It becomes a vitalistic nihilism, a nihilism that denies all absolute values except the expression of vitality, in which sexuality, of course, is the primary classical channel of feeling alive, right? But not only that. Now, this does not conduct a critique of the regime, does not conduct a critique of the system, because it embraces its philosophical assumptions, and it just, in a sense, buys into it, because he rejects maybe the philanthropic humanitarian rhetoric of the regime, but it doesn't reject its fundamental philosophical assumption.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that struck me from Del Noce was some of it. It's surprising how useful he is for diagnosing and taking apart a lot of things that people attach themselves to, thinking that they're battling the regime. And you read Del Noce and you're like, wait a minute, they're not battling the regime at all. They basically have just absorbed it. It's almost a way of remaining the same and not battling your fundamental presuppositions while convincing yourself that you're doing something heroic in opposing this grand, the bourgeois regime that sort of looms over us all.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
yeah. Now, I was going to say, you go ahead.
Just a comment on that. I mean, I always like to say that a very scientific society, especially a very pragmatic society like the United States, sometimes doesn't spend enough effort in trying to really understand its own philosophy. I mean, in a sense, that's the curse of somebody who thinks that philosophy is passé. You will have a philosophy without knowing it. Now, in particular, the question of what is the crucial political divide in our time was one of Del Noce's great concerns, and you can make a list of fake divides. Right? You can say, you can say that the divide is between, between fascism and democracy, or you could say that the divide is between progressive humanitarianism and right-wing elitism or whatever, worship of strength and power. You could say that the divide is between freedom and totalitarianism. That would be probably one that Del Noce would be more open to. There is a lot of these oppositions that not necessarily capture what's going on. Now, Del Noce in this paper speech from 1967 in The Age of Secularization argues that for him, the great divide is between two anthropologies. A vision of man as imago Dei, as divine image, as a religious creature, essentially, a creature that asks religious questions and, in a sense, is participate in a universal logos, which he calls a broadly Platonic vision, and then what he calls an instrumentalist vision, in the sense a vision that denies transcendence, that denies the logos, that affirms that everything is an instrument, including ideas are an instrument for the affirmation of human power. Then this human power can express itself as political redemption in a leftist way, can express itself in an individualist, Nietzschean, vitalist way, right? But these are at the more superficial level of expression. Deep down, there is this fundamental denial of the divine image, is fundamental denial of the logos. To him, that's the big division, and you can see that, again, even if you go back historically, fascists shared a lot of philosophical presupposition with other secular movement. Even then, it came to very different appearances, right? But one should try to look through those, to see through those appearances.
Well, and that's, I think, because of his devout Catholicism, is one of the things that separates him from some other analysis. And that's one of the reasons why I like Jacques Ellul as well, too, because, Ellul's rooting in the Reformed tradition also gives his analysis something that others do not. And I think one of the other things that Del Noce notes is this divide between, your fundamental human condition. So those that would argue that we are born, a blank slate or good, right, versus those who understand that we are flawed and sinful, right, creates two very different political outcomes.
Exactly. That's another divide, which is very relevant and nobody talks about. All the current political movements are in some sense Pelagian. In the sense that you can have a right-wing Rousseau or a left-wing Rousseau, but Del Noce sees Rousseau as the first modern secular Pelagian. This is a description. The idea that there is nothing wrong with us, that the human condition is fundamentally normal, what he calls rationalism. In the problem of atheism, he calls rationalism. This normality or normalness of the human condition totally shapes political positions. If you scratch the surface of a political position, you always can find that question. Is there anything wrong with us? Is there any limitation to what we can do? Can we achieve whatever you want? You know what I mean? That is a crucial philosophical presupposition which is never discussed.
No. And that's the thing too, is the corollary to that, it would seem, is that the sense, if we can get the engineering right for the externals, the human being within that engineered context will just simply enjoy a blessed life.
Exactly. But you see that when you grant that, you already have dug a huge ditch in political outcomes.
Whereas the Middle Ages thinker, for that you could call it backwards, or at least understood that crime is not a problem that you can solve. It's just something that has to be an ever-present reality that has to be managed.
Yes, exactly. The point is also simply that politics cannot submit every aspect of social life and culture to itself, which is Del Noce's definition of totalitarianism. To Del Noce, totalitarianism, as you know, is not manifestations like the Gulag or the lagers or whatever per se, but what brings you there. And what brings us to totalitarianism for Del Noce is this idea that ultimately politics can be a form of a substitute for religion. It can be the road to salvation. That ultimately politics can be the road to salvation. And so, in a sense, everything becomes political. In a sort of analogy with what happens in religious faiths. But is that so? And so if you don't criticize that, then you can get very unexpected outcomes. When we say that, reintroducing the question of original sin, Del Noce was a devout Catholic, but he was not, I don't think, an integralist in the sense that he didn't think that you need to have some kind of confessional state of any sort. Where he thinks you can formulate this divide in a more philosophical than theological language. You don't need. To me, this is one of the. To be honest, I think is one of the weaknesses of kind of American evangelical politics, in the sense that how do you conduct a correct mediation between faith and politics? Right. One thing you can try. I personally sympathize. You can try to import explicitly religious values and precepts into politics. Okay, I personally am open, if done correct way, to that. But the truth of the matter is that, especially in a very secular society like ours, what really has to be defended more than explicit prescriptions are certain fundamental assumptions, like the one we were discussing before. I mean, which can be formulated in purely anthropological terms, right? I mean, like the question whether there is something in the individual that transcends the collective, right? Or for instance, whether there is something about the human condition which is a constant experience of contradiction that is not going to ever be removed. And if we have to be, as the Noce says, anti-perfectists, meaning that we cannot think that what is the place of politics in culture, what is that should be superior to politics, what should politics be subordinated to. All these things are decisions that ultimately have a religious background, but they can be affirmed and discussed on their own terms, right? Without making a specific appeal to this or that religious tradition, because many religious traditions can agree about these issues. You see what I'm trying to say? I mean,
yeah.
And in this respect, since I was conducting my respectful critique of some aspects of evangelical culture, and evangelical culture, I see a presence of theology or philosophy. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but
yeah, I don't know.
Say that again.
No, I think that, and that's this really is one of the questions of our time. I think, especially in the North American context, is as the center of the sort of the old, like the post-war consensus, and the center kind of breaks down because the religious vision that went behind it is disintegrating, and as you see sort of this new left-wing religiosity rising, you can see conservative Christians beginning to realize that there is no one in the public realm looking out for our interests, and we have to do it ourselves. And so they're all of a sudden, where this relationship between church and state has not really been worked out extensively, as maybe say it would be in like the Dutch Reform context that I'm familiar with Kuyper and so forth. That now you have a whole generation of Christians who are figuring having to sort of rediscover or figure out for themselves again, what does it mean that we as Christians take direct action in the public realm? And I think, in this early stage of this sort of new movement, there's going to be a lot of fits and starts and wrong ends and turns, but I think it is generally starting to happen that people are figuring this out. And again, you've got all these traditions. You've got Protestants, you've got evangelicals, and you've got like Catholics as well too, the Orthodox, and some of these traditions with the Catholics, especially. There's a long tradition of discussing the relationship between the state and church in that regard.
Yes, I know, but you see, the point I was trying to make about the need to really work on the philosophical background, or. Okay, I mean, people make fun of the fact that, you have this, politicians backed by evangelicals, and then every Supreme Court justice is Catholic. I mean, people make fun of that, but it does point to what you were talking about, I think, that people have a desire for a more human and more Christian politics. But then when you have to choose the personnel, you need to train them in such a way that they can operate in a very secular society, at least not at the level of an explicit, theological argument, but understanding the anthropological and cultural implications of Christianity in a way that can find a space in the public square, if it can, okay? And it's not automatic that it can, but I mean, what I'm trying to say is that it's necessary to work harder on synthesis of faith and reason. We have to show that faith. I think Kuyper was a good example. For all I know, that faith really illuminates reason in a way that can be presented not as a dogmatic statement, but as a discovery, because faith helps the intelligence.
And it is. I think I mean, even within the biblical text itself, I mean, you go back to the wisdom tradition, and in many ways, that's a lot of what is happening there, is taking things that are explicitly religious and then making them, in a sense, practical and philosophical,
Right.
more so than specifically, the attitude of like, thus says the Lord.
Exactly.
Now, one of the things that I found interesting from Del Noce was this idea that we often look at, the divide, say, between conservative and liberalism. But one of the things that Del Noce noted is that if you examine it for what it is and realize that, those in power are looking to conserve the status quo,
Right.
that in fact, the bourgeois progressive movement is actually the conservatism of our day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Del Noce was very realistic. I mean, he had this idea that in some sense, the most conservative forces today have appropriated the language that used to be the language of the left. Because this language of individual liberation, autonomy, totally separated from the idea of a social revolution or of a collective change, has this patina of being progressive, but doesn't really change anything in society. It does not aim at changing anything whatsoever in society. It's aimed, now if you want to criticize my own line of job, if you look at the American academia, some of, not the public institutions like where I work, but in some of these great private universities, they are totally symbolic of what we are talking about, because they are this super enormously rich institution that hold great cultural and social prestige, that hang onto it desperately, and they would not want to change a comma in the system, and they know all based on legacy admission and so on and so forth. So, and they see themselves at the forefront of progressivism. You know what I mean?
You can't square that circle.
Right. No, it is kind of comical in a sense, except that you can have this is what makes the situation so confusing. I mean, that you have all this Marxist, not Marxist, but revolutionary progressive language, which has been hijacked by the upper bourgeoisie. That's what the Noce would say.
Yeah, to preserve their power.
Exactly.
Yeah. So and it's hard to think in that, and that's why he makes a point, is that revolutionary fervor then gets redirected against the enemies of the the middle class, the traditionalist, the religious, become that energy is then directed towards them and away from themselves. Yeah, and so because Marxism becomes a tool for maintaining bourgeois power, which is just and
it used to be the enemy. Then the enemy becomes those who are backward, those who are repressed, the bigot. There is a lot of name, the deplorables. The thing is the foil, is the rhetorical foil for a fake revolution in some sense. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, and that's why these memes are like, it's all fake, and it's the last thing, maybe just before we wind this up, one of the things that the sections that I really enjoyed in The Crisis of Modernity was Del Noce's extended discussion on the nature of authority. And I found this particularly enlightening, especially reading it in the midst of, the COVID lockdowns and so forth, and the obvious failures of authority that we see, the various means that have been used to justify authority. And I found particularly interesting was Del Noce's, rooting in the older forms of the word, and then how we've become afraid of this idea in the modern, in its attachment to authoritarianism. Perhaps you could walk people through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, then the first question one can ask is there anything we can call authority separated from power? Right? Because our assumption today, and this is another heritage of, if not Marxism, at least Marxism-inspired thinkers, is that ultimately there is only power. That ultimately, in a materialistic world, and this is true on the right again, as well as on the left, right? There is only power. I mean, there is the ability to make change, and you can be a leftist who wants to bring about good change. I'm sorry, because you are a good guy, or you can be a right winger who wants to exercise power to expand your vitality again, because you read Nietzsche and figure out that you can be, that kind of guy. But you see that in both cases, there is no possibility of an authority. Now, what is an authority? For the Noce, the experience of authority goes back not so much to Christianity, but to the Greeks, to Socrates and Plato, is the affirmation that our reason has to submit to some truths in a way which is liberating, not oppressive. I mean, and you can read the Plato dialogues in that sense, but as a mathematician, I can just say that when you recognize the answer to a mathematical problem, it has a certain weight that on your reason that you have to submit, you have to obey, you have to say yes. But in this saying yes, again, you are not oppressed, but you are liberated, you are more. Okay, so that's why Del Noce draws a connection between authority and what he calls the Greek discovery of evidence, not in the English sense of the word, but in the sense of being evident, right? That there are things that are evident, and recognizing evidence is a submission which liberates. Okay, so this is kind of the philosophical background. Now, again, a lot of the modern effort is to deny that there is such a thing as authority, because, as I said before, for Del Noce, the big opposition between this instrumentalism, which sees everything open to be changed by man, and a more traditional vision of givenness, that some aspects of reality are given, and you, again, are free by receiving the given, not by imposing yourself on the given. And this negation of authority, in this sense, it can be found in Hegel, for example. Hegel was Marx's philosophical teacher, and if you read, there is a very famous French interpreter of Hegel, Alexandre Kojève, with a very interesting read. There is this idea that givenness is oppressive, and that man becomes man by standing against givenness and opposing givenness and creating his own world, right? You see that in this second vision, authority is necessarily bad, because it is the givenness that stands in the way of your self-affirmation. And then there is only power. Okay, so I don't know if this helps, but so you see that there is a fork in the road. Either we recognize that what liberates us is the givenness that we can recognize with our reason, or we set ourselves in opposition to the givenness of life with our power, and there is no authority. And clearly, for Del Noce, the 20th century took a strong turn towards the second attitude, the denial of authority, which he says, authority is denial of the father, right? Because the figure of the father is a biological, social, psychological symbol of the fact that you don't make yourself, but you are given, right? The father is the incarnation of that givenness. And ultimately, for us, the father is always abusive, is bad, is what we have to free ourselves from. You know what I mean? And you see that then from there is the old religious background to that. But anyway.
Yeah, and to me, one of the things I appreciated in this, and especially to his discussion of immanentism and so forth, was not only his willingness to say that we have to recognize metaphysical realities, but also, and he explicitly says that, is supernatural reality. So there is the sense of the presence of God in the spiritual realm, and that the man of authority is the one, as you say, who's able to apprehend these realities and grasp them. And I think there's some sense that our modern age is terrified of the person of authority, because there's something beyond that they can't. I guess if it comes from the metaphysical or the supernatural, there's this sense that you have to submit to it. There's a kind of "thus says the Lord" quality to it, right, that our modern materialist world wants to deny.
Yes, there is certainly that. I mean, Del Noce is very struck by Hegel's comment on Genesis, where Hegel says that God confirms the words of the serpent, because the serpent says that you will be like gods, and God seems to agree, according to Hegel. And there is this idea that by setting ourselves against authority, we achieve our freedom, that we achieve our fulfillment by setting ourselves up against givenness. And so givenness is given to us as a polemical adversary to overcome, to fulfill ourselves by ourselves. So you see, there is you will see that in a sense our age does a deep cultural interpretation of original sin, which is a little bit worrisome, but
But in that sense, then transhumanism and transgenderism become, in that way, kind of the ultimate expression of this sort of liberation from givenness.
Yes, could be the ultimate expression, or could be also the place where it comes to hits a wall, for all we know. You know what I mean? Because the consequences are at some point fly in the face of very fundamental human experiences. So I mean, the Noce always warns us against thinking that the secular, whatever, revolutionary modern project is triumphant. In his opinion, it is triumphant as much as it is self-destructive. So one has to be very realistic. In fact, that some of these extreme phenomena can be scary because they're extreme, but their extremity, whatever, is that the word? Their being extreme is also a sign of a crisis.
Well, and I think that's why he goes, and I wish, this is one of those things where I wish I read Italian, because he goes back to, suggests as an alternate between the two, the future utopianism and the past utopianism, this third way of rooting oneself in a living tradition. And there's a cardinal that I think he goes back to, and his name is escaping me now. There was a writer that he says you can begin with, not that the Enlightenment, but you can begin with Kant, and you don't necessarily have to end up with modernity, that there's another path that you can go on as long as you may remain connected to the metaphysical and the supernatural. And I'm trying to, it's a religious author, philosopher, and I'm trying to remember his name now.
Was it from the 18th century or later?
I think so, yes. And he says there's this other, he suggests this other path in The Crisis of Modernity and in The Problem of Atheism. And I realized, none of his works have been translated into English. Well, that's unfortunate.
Would it be Gerdil, Gerdil?
Could be. If I find it, maybe I'll put it in the show notes. But anyways.
The Noce is that we don't have to be anti-modern. We have to have, we have to recognize that modernity needs help because it is really coming. I mean, in the Noce's view, after this suicide of the revolution, we have a complete lack of ideas that can propel a society or a social life. That it's easy to be shocked by these extreme phenomena, but you have to recognize that there is a void. So I mean, that's at least my understanding, that filling the void is in some sense even more crucial than resisting the extreme manifestation.
Yeah, and that's kind of in a sense, to get out of the trap of being a revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, this sense of door number 3. And that, I think, is what Del Noce was trying to offer us, was an access to door number 3.
I think so.
Yeah. And I guess with that, let's leave that. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Carlo. And
me too.
Can you tell us what you mentioned that you're working on another translation? Maybe before we go, you can tease us with what's coming.
Yeah, that's the 4th volume. Is a book called The Suicide of the Revolution, and it is a book in which Del Noce reckons with Italian cultural history of the 20th century, which makes it kind of specialized, I must confess. On the other hand, the Italian cultural history of the 20th century includes fascism and Gramscism, which is one of the most important forms of Western Marxism. So you see, these two things, fascism and Western Marxism, are still relevant. This is why the book, I think, is very enlightening to understand our world, but it really goes into the weeds of Italian cultural history of the 20th century. So we'll see what reception it finds, but it is one of certainly of the books he most cared about, because it shows that Italy is like, he says, a microcosm, a paradigm of a more general process. This more general process of revolutionary thinking that ends up in nihilism.
Yeah. Well, I for one am looking forward to it. So I have the 3 first volumes, and I've enjoyed working. I'm in the middle of the problem of atheism. As I mentioned to you when I messaged you, I have this bad habit of ordering books from the library and interlibrary loan, and because those have due dates, those get read first, and so I keep putting the problem of atheism down.
The way is one of his hardest book to read, in my opinion. So you have to take your time. It's good.
Well, that's what I have been doing, and it takes a little bit to digest it. But I'm really looking to get into, and as I mentioned too, as you say, it's a complicated topic, but I'm looking to get into his work on ontologism, which to me, in my own particular journey and so forth, is very exciting. So, anyways, thank you for your time, Carlo, and I wish you well. And with that, bid you a good day.
Thank you very much.